Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to The Well-Told Tale. Every week we bring you the finest science fiction and fantasy stories ever written. We have reached part 6 of The First Men in the Moon by H.G. Wells. Mr. Bedford and Mr. Cavour have lost the sphere, their spacecraft, amidst the fast-growing plant life of the moon, and are desperately trying to find it again. When they think they hear, is that the bellow of animal life? It's time to pull up a chair, relax, and enjoy part 6 of The First Men in the Moon by H.G. Wells. 11. The Mooncalf Pastures. So we two poor terrestrial castaways, lost in that wild-growing moon jungle, crawled in terror before the sounds that had come upon us. We crawled, as it seemed, a long time before we saw either selenite or mooncalf, though we heard the bellowing and gruntulous noises of these latter continually drawing nearer to us. We crawled through stony ravines, over snow slopes, amidst fungi that ripped like thin bladders at our thrust, emitting a watery humour, over a perfect pavement of things like puffballs, and beneath interminable thickets of scrub. And ever more helplessly our eyes sought for our abandoned sphere. The noise of the mooncalves would at times be a vast, flat, calf-like sound. At times it rose to an amazed and wrathy bellowing, and again it would become a clogged bestial sound, as though these unseen creatures had sought to eat and bellow at the same time. Our first view was but an inadequate transitory glimpse, yet none the less disturbing because it was incomplete. Cavour was crawling in front at the time, and he first was aware of their proximity. He stopped dead, arresting me with a single gesture. A crackling and smashing of the scrub appeared to be advancing directly upon us, and then, as we squatted close and endeavoured to judge of the nearness and direction of this noise, there came a terrific bellow behind us, so close and vehement that the tops of the bayonet scrub bent before it, and one felt the breath of it hot and moist. And turning about, we saw indistinctly through a crowd of swaying stems the mooncalf's shining sides, and the long line of its back loomed out against the sky. Of course, it is hard for me now to say how much I saw at that time, because my impressions were corrected by subsequent observation. First of all impressions was its enormous size. The girth of its body was some 80 feet, its length perhaps 200. Its size rose and fell with its laboured breathing. I perceived that its gigantic, flabby body lay along the ground, and that its skin was of a corrugated white, dappling into blackness along the backbone. But of its feet we saw nothing. I think that we saw then the profile at least of the almost brainless head, with its fat-encumbered neck, its slobbering omnivorous mouth, its little nostrils and tight-shut eyes, for the mooncalf invariably shuts its eyes in the presence of the sun. We had a glimpse of a vast red pit as it opened its mouth to bleat and bellow again. We had a breath from the pit, and then the monster heeled over like a ship, dragging forward along the ground, creasing all its leathery skin, rolled again and so wallowed past us, smashing a path amidst the scrub, and was speedily hidden from our eyes by the dense interlacings beyond. Another appeared more distantly, and then another, and then, as though he was guiding these animated lumps of provender to their pasture, a selenite came momentarily into ken. My grip upon Cavour's foot became convulsive at the sight of him, and we remained motionless and peering long after he had passed out of our range. By contrast with the mooncalves, he seemed a trivial being, a mere ant scarcely 5 feet high. He was wearing garments of some leathery substance, so that no portion of his actual body appeared, but of this, of course, we were entirely ignorant. He presented himself, therefore, as a compact, bristling creature, having much of the quality of a complicated insect, with whip-like tentacles and a clanging arm, projecting from his shining cylindrical body case. The form of his head was hidden by his enormous many-spiked helmet. We discovered afterwards that he used the spikes for prodding refractory mooncalves, and a pair of goggles of darkened glass, set very much at the side, gave a bird-like quality to the metallic apparatus that covered his face. His arms did not project beyond his body case, and he carried himself upon short legs that, wrapped though they were in warm coverings, seemed to our terrestrial eyes inordinately flimsy. They had very short thighs, very long shanks, and little feet. In spite of his heavy-looking clothing, he was progressing with what would be, from the terrestrial point of view, very considerable strides, and his clanging arm was busy. The quality of his motion during the instant of his passing suggested haste and a certain anger, and soon after we had lost sight of him, we heard the bellow of a mooncalf change abruptly into a short, sharp squeal, followed by the scuffle of its acceleration. And gradually that bellowing receded, and then came to an end, as if the pastures sought had been attained. We listened. For a space the moon world was still, but it was some time before we resumed our crawling search for the vanished sphere. When next we saw mooncalves, they were some little distance away from us in a place of tumbled rocks. The less vertical surfaces of the rocks were thick with a speckled green plant growing in dense mossy clumps upon which these creatures were browsing. We stopped at the edge of the reeds amidst which we were crawling at the sight of them, peered out at them, and then looked around for a second glimpse of a selenite. They lay against their food like stupendous slugs, huge, greasy hulls, eating greedily and noisily, with a sort of sobbing avidity. They seemed monsters of mere fatness, clumsy and overwhelmed to a degree that would make a Smithfield ox seem a model of agility. Their busy, writhing, chewing mouths and eyes closed, together with the appetizing sound of their munching, made up an effort of animal enjoyment that was singularly stimulating to our empty frames. "Hogs," said Cavour with unusual passion. "Disgusting hogs!" And after one glare of angry envy, crawled off through the bushes to our right. I stayed long enough to see that the speckled plant was quite hopeless for human nourishment, then crawled after him, nibbling a quill of it between my teeth. Presently we were arrested again by the proximity of a selenite, and this time we were able to observe him more exactly. Now we could see that the selenite was covered indeed with clothing, and not a sort of crustacean integument. He was quite similar in his costume to the former one we had glimpsed, except that ends of something like wadding were protruding from his neck, and he stood on a promontory of rock and moved his head this way and that, as though he was surveying the crater. We lay quite still, fearing to attract his attention if we moved, and after a time he turned about and disappeared. We came across another drove of mooncalves bellowing up a ravine, and then we passed over a place of sounds of beating machinery, as if some huge hall of industry came near the surface there. And while these sounds were still about us, we came to the edge of a great open space, perhaps 200 yards in diameter and perfectly level. Save for a few lichens that advanced from its margin, this space was bare and presented a powdery surface of a dusty yellow colour. We were afraid to strike out across this space, but as it presented less obstruction to our crawling than the scrub, we went down upon it and began very circumspectly to skirt its edge. For a little while, the noises from below ceased, and everything save for the faint stir of the growing vegetation was very still. Then abruptly there began an uproar, louder, more vehement, and nearer than any we had heard so far. Of a certainty it came from below. Instinctively we crouched as flat as we could, ready for a prompt plunge into the thicket beside us. Each knock and throb seemed to vibrate through our bodies. Louder grew this throbbing and beating, and that irregular vibration increased until the whole moon world seemed to be jerking and pulsing. "Cover!" whispered Cavour, and I turned towards the bushes. At that instant came a thud, like the thud of a gun, and then a thing happened. It still haunts me in my dreams. I had turned my head to look at Cavour's face, and thrust out my hand in front of me as I did so, and my hand met nothing. I plunged suddenly into a bottomless hole. My chest hit something hard, and I found myself with my chin on the edge of an unfathomable abyss that had suddenly opened beneath me, my hand extended stiffly into the void. The whole of that flat circular area was no more than a gigantic lid that was now sliding sideways from off the pit it had covered into a slot prepared for it. Had it not been for Cavour, I think I should have remained rigid, hanging over this margin and staring into the enormous gulf below, until at last the edges of the slot scraped me off and hurled me into its depths. But Cavour had not received the shock that had paralysed me. He had been a little distance from the edge when the lid had first opened, and, perceiving the peril that held me helpless, gripped my legs and pulled me backwards. I came into a sitting position, crawled away from the edge for a space on all fours, then staggered up and ran after him across the thundering, quivering sheet of metal. It seemed to be swinging open with a steadily accelerated velocity, and the bushes in front of me shifted sideways as I ran. I was none too soon. Cavour's back vanished amidst the bristling thicket, and I scrambled up after him. The monstrous valve came into its position with a clang. For a long time we lay panting, not daring to approach the pit. But at last, very cautiously and bit by bit, we crept into a position from which we could peer down. The bushes about us creaked and waved with the force of a breeze that was blowing down the shaft. We could see nothing at first except smooth vertical walls, descending at last into an impenetrable black. And then, very gradually, we became aware of a number of very faint and little lights going to and fro. For a time, that stupendous gulf of mystery held us so that we forgot even our sphere. In time, as we grew more accustomed to the darkness, we could make out very small, dim, elusive shapes moving about among those needlepoint illuminations. We peered amazed and incredulous, understanding so little that we could find no words to say. We could distinguish nothing that would give us a clue as to the meaning of the faint shapes we saw. "What can it be?" I asked. "What can it be?" "The engineering. They must live in these caverns during the night and come out during the day." "Cavour," I said, "can they be that? It was something like men?" "That was not a man. We dare risk nothing. We dare do nothing until we find the sphere. We can do nothing until we find the sphere." He assented with a groan and stirred himself to move. He stared about him for a space, sighed and indicated a direction. We struck out through the jungle. For a time we crawled resolutely, then with diminishing vigour. Presently, among great shapes of flabby purple, there came a noise of trampling and cries about us. We lay close, and for a long time the sounds went to and fro and very near, but this time we saw nothing. I tried to whisper to Cavour that I could hardly go without food much longer, but my mouth had become too dry for whispering. "Cavour," I said, "I must have food." He turned a face full of dismay towards me. "It's a case for holding out," he said. "But I must," I said, "and look at my lips. I've been thirsty some time. If only some of that snow had remained. It's clean gone. We're driving from Arctic to tropical at the rate of a degree a minute." I gnawed my hand. "The sphere," he said. "There is nothing for it but the sphere." We roused ourselves to another spurt of crawling. My mind ran entirely on edible things, on the hissing profundity of summer drinks. More particularly, I craved for beer. I was haunted by the memory of a 16-gallon cask that had swaggered in my cellar. I thought of the adjacent larder, and especially of steak and kidney pie, tender steak and plenty of kidney, and rich, thick gravy between. Ever and again I was seized with fits of hungry yawning. We came to flat places overgrown with fleshy red things, monstrous coralline growths, and we pushed against them as they snapped and broke. I noted the quality of the broken surfaces. The confounded stuff certainly looked of a biteable texture. Then it seemed to me that it smelt rather well. I picked up a fragment and sniffed at it. "Cavour," I said in a hoarse undertone. He glanced at me with his face screwed up. "Don't," he said. I put down the fragment, and we crawled on through this tempting fleshiness for a space. "Cavour?" I asked. "Why not?" "Poison," I heard him say, but he did not look round. We crawled some way before I decided. "I'll chance it," said I. He made a belated gesture to prevent me. I stuffed my mouth full. He crouched, watching my face, his own twisted into the oddest expression. "It's good," I said. "Oh, Lord," he cried. He watched me munch, his face wrinkled between desire and disapproval, and then suddenly succumbed to appetite and began to tear off huge mouthfuls. For a time we did nothing but eat. The stuff was not unlike a terrestrial mushroom, only it was much laxer in texture, and as one swallowed it, it warmed the throat. At first we experienced a mere mechanical satisfaction in eating. Then our blood began to run warmer, and we tingled at the lips and fingers, and then new and slightly irrelevant ideas came bubbling up in our minds. "It's good," said I. "Infernally good. What a home for our surplus population, our poor surplus population." And I broke off another large portion. It filled me with a curiously benevolent satisfaction that there was such good food in the moon. The depression of my hunger gave way to an irrational exhilaration. The dread and discomfort in which I had lived vanished entirely. I perceived the moon no longer as a planet from which I most earnestly desired the means of escape, but as a possible refuge from human destitution. I think I forgot the selenites, the moon calves, the lid, and the noises completely, so soon as I had eaten that fungus. Cavour replied to my third repetition of my surplus population remark with similar words of approval. I felt that my head swam, but I put this down to the stimulating effect of the food after a long fast. "Excellent discovery, yours, Cavour," said I. "Send you on that too?" "What do you mean?" said Cavour. "Discovery of the moon. Send only to the Toto?" I looked at him, shocked at his suddenly hoarse voice, and by the badness of his articulation, it occurred to me in a flash that he was intoxicated, possibly by the fungus. It also occurred to me that he erred in imagining that he had discovered the moon. He had not discovered it, he had only reached it. I tried to lay my hand on his arm and explain this to him, but the issue was too subtle for his brain. It was also unexpectedly difficult to express. After a momentary attempt to understand me, I remember wondering if the fungus had made my eyes as fishy as his. He set off upon some observations of his own account. "We are," he announced with a solemn hiccup, "the creatures, what we eat and drink." He repeated this, and as I was now in one of my subtle moods, I determined to dispute it. Possibly I wandered a little from the point, but Cavour certainly did not attend at all properly. He stood up as well as he could, putting a hand on my head to steady himself, which was disrespectful, and stood staring about him, quite devoid now of any fear of the moon beings. I tried to point out that this was dangerous for some reason that was not perfectly clear to me, but the word dangerous had somehow got mixed with indiscreet, and came out rather more like injurious than either, and after an attempt to disentangle them, I resumed my argument, addressing myself principally to the unfamiliar but attentive coralline growths on either side. I felt that it was necessary to clear up this confusion between the moon and a potato at once. I wandered into a long parenthesis on the importance of precision of definition in argument. I did my best to ignore the fact that my bodily sensations were no longer agreeable. In some way that I have now forgotten, my mind was led back to projects of colonization. "We must annex this moon," I said. "There must be no shilly-shally. This is part of, Wyman's burthen. Cavour, we are satrap. Nempa season never dreamt. Been all the newspapers. Cavorekia, Bedfordicia, limited. Mean unlimited. Practically Certainly, I was intoxicated. I embarked upon an argument to show the infinite benefits our arrival would confer upon the moon. I involved myself in a rather difficult proof that the arrival of Columbus was, on the whole, beneficial to America. I found I had forgotten the line of argument I had intended to pursue, and continued to repeat, "Simla Columbus," to fill up time. From that point, my memory of the action of that abominable fungus becomes confused. I remember vaguely that we declared our intention of standing no nonsense from any confounded insects, that we decided it ill became men to hide shamefully upon a mere satellite, that we equipped ourselves with huge armfuls of the fungus, whether for missile purposes or not, I do not know, and heedless of the stabs of the bayonet scrub, we started forth into the sunshine. Almost immediately, we must have come upon the selenites. There were 6 of them, and they were marching in single file over a rocky place, making the most remarkably piping and whining sounds. They all seemed to become aware of us at once. All instantly became silent and motionless like animals, with their faces turned towards us. For a moment, I was sobered. "Insects," murmured Cavour. "Insects, and they think I'm going to crawl about on my stomach, on my vertebrated stomach." "Stomach," he repeated slowly, as though he chewed the indignity. Then suddenly, with a sort of fury, he made 3 vast strides and leapt towards them. He leapt badly. He made a sort of series of somersaults in the air, whirled right over them, and vanished with an enormous splash amidst the cactus bladders. What the selenites made of this amazing and, to my mind, undignified eruption from another planet I have no means of guessing. I seem to remember the sight of their backs as they ran in all directions, but I'm not sure. All these last incidents before oblivion are vague and faint in my mind. I know I made a step to follow Cavour and tripped and fell headlong among the rocks. I was, I am certain, suddenly and vehemently ill. And I seem to remember a violent struggle and being gripped by metallic clasps. My next clear recollection is that we were prisoners at we knew not what depths beneath the moon's surface. We were in darkness amidst strange, distracting noises. Our bodies were covered with scratches and bruises, and our heads racked with pain. 12. The Selenite's Face. I found myself sitting crouched together in a tumultuous darkness. For a long time I could not understand where I was, nor how I had come to this perplexity. I thought of the cupboard into which I had been thrust at times when I was a child, and then of a very dark and noisy bedroom in which I had slept during an illness. But these sounds about me were not the noises I had known. There was a thin flavour in the air, like the wind of a stable. Then I supposed we must still be at work upon the sphere, and that somehow I had got into the cellar of Cavour's house. I remembered we had finished the sphere, and I fancied I must still be in it and travelling through space. "Cavour," I said, "cannot we have some light?" There came no answer. "Cavour," I insisted. I was answered by a groan. "My head," I heard him say, "my head." I attempted to press my hands to my brow, which ached, and discovered that they were tied together. This startled me very much. I brought them up to my mouth and felt the cold smoothness of metal. They were chained together. I tried to separate my legs and made out they were similarly fastened, and also that I was fastened to the ground by a much thicker chain about the middle of my body. I was more frightened than I had yet been of anything in all our strange experiences. For a time I tugged silently at my bonds. "Cavour!" I cried out sharply. "Why am I tied? Why have you tied me hand and foot?" "I haven't tied you," he answered. "It's the selenites." The selenites. My mind hung on that for a space. Then my memories came back to me. The snowy desolation, the thawing of the air, the growth of the plants, our strange hopping and crawling among the rocks and vegetation of the crater, all the distress of our frantic search for the sphere returned to me. Finally, the opening of the great lid that covered the pit. Then, as I strained to trace our later movements down to our present plight, The pain in my head became intolerable. I came to an insurmountable barrier, an obstinate blank. Cavour? Yes? Where are we? How should I know? Are we dead? What nonsense! They've got us, then. He made no answer but a grunt. The lingering traces of the poison seemed to make him oddly irritable. What do you mean to do? How should I know what to do? Oh, very well, said I, and I became silent. Presently, I was roused from a stupor. Oh, Lord, I wish you'd stop that buzzing. We lapsed into silence again, listening to the dull confusion of noises like a muffled sound of a street or factory that filled our ears. I could make nothing of it. My mind pursued first one rhythm and then another, and questioned it in vain. But after a long time I became aware of a new and sharper element, not mingling with the rest but standing out, as it were, against that cloudy background of sound. It was a series of relatively very little definite sounds, tappings and rubbings like a loose spray of ivy against a window or a bird moving about on a box. We listened and peered about us, but the darkness was a velvet pall. There followed a noise like the subtle movement of the wards of a well-oiled lock. And then there appeared before me, hanging as it seemed in an immensity of black, a thin, bright line. Look, whispered Cavour very softly. What is it? I don't know. We stared. The thin, bright line became a band, and broader and paler. It took upon itself the quality of a bluish light falling upon a whitewashed wall. It ceased to be parallel-sided. It developed a deep indentation on one side. I turned to remark this to Cavour, and was amazed to see his ear in a brilliant illumination, all the rest of him in shadow. I twisted my head round as well as my bonds would permit. Cavour, I said, it's behind. His ear vanished, gave place to an eye. Suddenly the crack that had been admitting the light broadened out and revealed itself as the space of an opening door. Beyond was a sapphire vista, and in the doorway stood a grotesque outline silhouetted against the glare. We both made convulsive efforts to turn, and failing, sat staring over our shoulders at this. My first impression was of some clumsy quadruped with a lowered head. Then I perceived it was the slender, pinched body and short and extremely attenuated bandy legs of a selenite, with his head depressed between his shoulders. He was without the helmet and body covering they wear upon the exterior. He was a blank black figure to us, but instinctively our imaginations supplied features to his very human outline. I, at least, took it instantly that he was somewhat hunchbacked, with the high forehead and long features. He came forward 3 steps and paused for a time. His movements seemed absolutely noiseless. Then he came forward again. He walked like a bird. His feet fell, one in front of the other. He stepped out of the ray of light that came through the doorway, and it seemed as though he vanished altogether in the shadow. For a moment my eyes sought him in the wrong place, and then I perceived him standing facing us both in the full light. Only the human features I had attributed to him were not there at all. Of course, I ought to have expected that, only I didn't. It came to me as an absolute, for a moment, an overwhelming shock. It seemed as though it wasn't a face, as though it must needs be a mask, a horror, a deformity that would presently be disavowed or explained. There was no nose, and the thing had dull, bulging eyes at the side. In the silhouette, I had supposed they were ears. There were no ears. I have tried to draw one of these heads, but I cannot. There was a mouth downwardly curved, like a human mouth that stares ferociously. The neck on which the head was poised was jointed in 3 places, almost like the short joints in the leg of a crab. The joints of the limbs I could not see because of the putty-like straps in which they were swathed and which formed the only clothing the being wore. There the thing was, looking at us. At the time, my mind was taken up by the mad impossibility of the creature. I suppose he also was amazed, and with more reason perhaps for amazement than we. Only, confound him, he did not show it. We did at least know what had brought about this meeting of incompatible creatures, but conceive how it would seem to decent Londoners, for example, to come upon a couple of living creatures as big as men and absolutely unlike any other earthly animals careering about among the sheep in Hyde Park. It must have taken him like that. Figure us. We were bound hand and foot, filthy, our beards 2 inches long, our faces scratched and bloody. Cavour, you must imagine, in his knickerbockers, torn in several places by the bayonet scrub, his Jaeger shirt and old cricket cap, his wiry hair wildly disordered, a tail to every quarter of the heavens. In that blue light, his face did not look red, but very dark. His lips and the drying blood upon my hands seemed black. If possible, I was in a worse plight than he, on account of the yellow fungus into which I had jumped. Our jackets were unbuttoned, and our shoes had been taken off and lay at our feet, and we were sitting with our backs to this queer bluish light, peering at such a monster as Dürer must have invented. Cavour broke the silence, started to speak, went hoarse and cleared his throat. Outside began a terrific bellowing, as if a mooncalf were in trouble. It ended in a shriek, and everything was still again. Presently the selenite turned about, flickered into the shadow, stood for a moment retrospective at the door, then closed it on us. And once more we were in that murmurous mystery of darkness into which we had awakened. And welcome back. I hope you enjoyed part 6 of The First Men in the Moon. If you'd like to support The Well-Told Tale as we make these classics available for free to everyone, thank you. The best way to do that is through my Patreon page. There's a link in the description. I'll be back next week with part 7 of the story. I hope you can join me.